Last week, Rob Mercer MLC called on Tynwald to reaffirm its opinion that the meat plant is a significant strategic asset for the Isle of Man, which has been severely affected by a number of changes in agricultural policies over the last 15 years. At the same sitting, Daphne Caine MHK succeeded in persuading Tynwald to acknowledge the global biodiversity and ecological crisis we are currently living through. They joined former leader of the Manx Farmers Union, Tim Johnston MHK, to discuss all this and more. Is government serious about food security? Or is it just jam tomorrow? I began by asking Rob Mercer about the Environment and Infrastructure Policy Review Committee's report.
I mean, it came out in the debate, the recent report by Bernie Consultancy. That went into much greater depth than our committee has done in the past, because they've looked into the operational aspects as well. And they've come up with a very comprehensive report that really does spell out. It kind of reinforces a little bit some of the findings from the original meat plant report, the Volume 1 report, which was published a year or so ago. But now, of course, it's given a bit more focus. It's given a bit more detail in terms of what needs to be fixed, what needs to be addressed.
And Tim Johnston, I think you're a member of the committee too, are you? But obviously you've got some insider knowledge a bit, having been in the agricultural industry and a leader of the Farmers Union. Do you think that the optimistic comments that Rob came out with in Tynwald, in which he said that there can be a relatively unsubsidised future for the meat plant, do you think that's possible?
Yes, I think that is right. I think we have to be realistic and say that, and remember that this is a multi-species plant on a small island. In the UK, you wouldn't get a situation like this, so there are always going to be extra challenges, as we know there are on the island generally. But I'm confident that it could be cost neutral. Could it make a profit on a downhill with a wind behind it on a good day? Maybe, but I think we can see a day where we can be confident that taxpayers' money is being put into something that's been well run and is providing an important service. I think that isn't the case at the moment, but I think yes, that can happen.
And Daphne, I mean, you weren't so much interested in the meat plant, but one of the other crucial plant on the island, processing plants on the island, is Laxey Glen Mill, which is wholly owned by the government. Were you content with some of the answers that you were getting from the various ministers in the Tynwald sitting?
I think there was an element of just answering simply what I'd asked, and the assurance that the flour mill has received funding from Treasury to replace the fire alarm. I think that was a smidge under £60,000, and they had an advance on the subvention of £41,000. About half of that has been paid over so far to the flour mills to keep it operational, along with a letter of support. So I don't doubt Treasury support for the flour mill. The element that's missing is, what is the long-term future? Is it flour milling on that scale when they've lost 80% of the major customer? And is it viable in a historic building such as the flour mill, which obviously is an iconic part of Laxey's architectural landscape that I feel should be preserved? So I've got two inquiries out at the minute. One is to the registered building section of planning to say, is this something they could look at for potential for registration to protect the building? But I've also asked the DEFA Minister if she would release the report that they've commissioned into the long-term future of flour milling on the island, so that we can all understand what that looks like.
Does government really understand what food security is? I mean, maybe, Rob, if we started with you on that.
That's a great question. I mean, certainly there's certain elements in the island plan. I think there's a recognition at a high level that food security is important. And I think the recent pandemic showed us that, in some respects, perhaps we were a bit lucky. There was no great disruption to global food chain supplies. But there's always that nagging doubt, isn't there, that, well, okay, were we lucky? And we do have the capability to produce a lot of food on the island for our population. I think the agricultural sector play a hugely important part in that. I think from a high level it's there. I'm not sure how that then translates into action on the ground. Perhaps that's something that the various departments responsible would have more comment on than me.
Tim, you will no doubt have noticed the irony that food security in certain politicians' minds seems to mean ensuring that the boat sails frequently and that we've got good supplies from the UK. As a former leader of the Farmers Union and a member representing a largely agricultural area, or one of the larger agricultural areas on the island, do you feel that maybe there's a misunderstanding as to what food security should mean, and perhaps we need to be a bit more focused on Manx stuff? Or are you content that actually wherever the food comes from, that's the most important bit?
I don't think the government has really addressed the issue. I think the easy answer is let's invest in another boat. MVRO that seems to be top of the list as far as food security is concerned. I think for years the government hasn't faced up to the challenges of agriculture and what it's meant to be about. We've had the Food Matters strategy, and I think we all have to welcome you only have to go to the Food and Drink Festival and see the myriad of local artisan produce that's on the island, which is great, and that's very positive. But that's not the answer for commercial agriculture. Never has been. I think that DEFRA have sort of concentrated on that and looked at those easy wins, and I don't think they're faced up to some of the fundamental challenges of agriculture. Average age of over 60. If you're looking at a major industry that manages 3/4 of the Isle of Man, and you're looking at an average age of over 60, any other industry and business, you'd be having serious concerns about what that means for the future. And I don't think the government are really grasping that. So I'm looking forward to their new agricultural strategy that they're coming into the new year. I'm concerned, once again, there'll be a lot of window dressing and talking about the environment, which is very, very important, don't get me wrong, but they're not facing up to some of the big challenges that commercial agriculture faces, and whether we actually want to have commercial agriculture on the island. Because there's also a difference between self-sufficiency and food security. And yes, we are, quite self-sufficient in many staples, but people's tastes have changed, and people's expectations, what they pay for food, is very different to the reality of what we can produce on the island. So there's some big questions that, as a society, we need to ask ourselves. This is not just about government. This is about consumers as well, about what they want to see when they look outside, and do they understand that commercial farming is part of a much bigger picture, but it's a very, very vital part of that.
Daphne Caine, would you have expected government to have done a bit more to try and ensure that we retained mass bread baking capacity on the island?
I don't think it's government's job to prop up businesses when perhaps business model and tastes are changing, and cost is a very important factor for people in the middle of a cost of living crisis with all the other pressures on household income. I think from the farming perspective that it is part of the whole picture, also from a sort of sustainable future point of view, and we need to have a very clear picture in our mind, and for government in terms of the policy direction of what is food security, what are the essentials that the Isle of Man needs to continue to provide in a viable way. So what is appropriate? £41,000 for the flour mill. Well, that's a fantastic operation, and I was fortunate enough to have a tour a few years ago where we saw the new bagging plant that they'd put in a conveyor belt, and actually it's a really high quality product, and they're pointing out, and yet, why can't they mirror what Isle of Man Creameries has done successfully with marketing cheese products as a quality product, artisan product, going out to America and further afield, and especially in the UK. Why aren't we successful doing that with the quality meats and the flour? And in terms of what's the appropriate size of the plants for the Isle of Man? And that's always been called into question. And I remember back to the original report into the meat plant that there were, they went out for tender for somebody to operate it. And there was a tenderer that I'm still baffled why the DEFRA minister of the day, I think it was Mr Baker, why they didn't opt for that instead of putting themselves into running it with a forever £2 million subvention from government. So it's, from a farming perspective, and Garth is also largely, agricultural, we want to have a successful farming industry that is rewarding for and attractive for younger people to come into, because all of us enjoy the appearance of the island, and without farmers we're not going to have that. And I think there have been advances with the agri-environment scheme. Some of that's been successful, some of it not quite working for smaller farm holders. Is that right? Yeah. Mr Johnston would know better than I would, but it's all interlinked. And we also have to come back to the basics of the local spend. You buy local, whether that's your food or your products, your jewellery. It has a much higher benefit to buy local on island spend and food for spreading that wealth and enhancing our food security. And I think just the way we live generally, and how you switch people's habits back to that, because everybody was happily buying Laxey flour during the COVID pandemic and the shortages, but and also local bread. But suddenly that's, there was a massive increase, I think, in people baking their own bread. But we've all changed and gone back to bad habits to what's easy and convenient. And I think that does come down to fundamentals of a food security, not just the staples, how we get everyone to buy into that.
You mentioned that we've gone back to bad habits, but actually the problem is you can't buy Manx bread from many shops these days. It's a real struggle to find. You have to know which shop to go to and at what time to be able to buy Manx bread. Would you say, Rob, that this is just something that has to be left to the marketplace, or does government have a role in ensuring that staple products are securely supplied on the island?
Well, I mean, of course, we have to. I think it's worth a shout out to Noah and to Ross Bakery. The two that I regularly purchase. Whether they're ever going to be set up to be able to compete with, with the brands that you see in Tesco, that's a different story. They're not mass; they're more artisan products. I think that's. I don't think it's for government to choose what products need to be, on the supermarket shelves. That's down to consumers. I think that would be a complete overreach of government to make those kind of decisions.
And yet, Tim, government invested heavily, particularly in the meat plant, and indeed Minister Thomas was happy to take the credit for all the hard work of previous DEFRA ministers of getting the money to allow the meat plant to be in its current condition. There was talk, and certainly going back to my time in DEFRA, of a combined mill and bakery, and a new purpose-built building being built with then somebody from the private sector coming in to run it for us. That talk seems to have disappeared.
Yeah, and I think it's. I think what we have to look at for me is when we're looking at adding value is the key to this, and working out as a policy, where do we want agriculture to be on the island, and where's the route to market. I think that's the key. Daphne mentioned the creamery, and it's done an excellent job of adding value to a product, building a story behind it, adding provenance, and then being able to sell that at a premium. Now, it's a lot easier to do that with a dairy product than it is with red meat. There's some very strong trademarks in the UK, for example, Scotch beef, Welsh lamb, and they struggle. But I think what we need to do is making sure that we are doing all we can to add value to what we're producing and have that story. And some of the debate last week was about the biosphere and the value of that. And again, I've been critical of that in that I'm very supportive of the principle of the biosphere. But I think we failed to really get the value out of it. People have been happy to talk off the back of it, but there hasn't been the seriousness and the resource, I don't think, put into it. Because these are the sort of things we need to do to be unique and add value, so that we're producing a product that means that then things like talking about a viable meat plant and a viable bread industry on the island, when you're producing a product that's got a premium and it's got a value and it's got export potential, then you're starting to talk about something that's sustainable. Because if there is a limit to what taxpayers can do, and I think it's right that potentially there is investment in this, but there needs to be a long-term plan. I think people need to see there's value from that, because you can justify it over the long period. And if you can justify that, you can then justify supporting the industry as a whole. But we have to remember about those unique challenges we have on the Isle of Man. If you're in Cheshire and you drive down the A12, farm after farm, you'll see bed and breakfasts, homemade ice cream, all these things that you can do when you've got a large population. But we haven't got that over here. I think the danger is that the department sometimes has maybe hoped and felt that other things would come along to fill the gaps, to add value, to help farmers. But there's a limit. We have to understand that there's a critical mass to agriculture on the island, and we have to support that. If it is to survive and go forward, we have to support that critical mass. And that also includes some level of commodity agriculture. Because if you don't have the critical mass, you can't, everything falls away. I think that's the thing.
And Daphne Caine, I mean, you had a motion down talking about the global biodiversity and ecological crisis and asking Tynwald to acknowledge that, which they did. They didn't link it to the Biosphere Isle of Man's vision for a sustainable future. Instead, they decided to link it to the 2015 biodiversity strategy. Now, I recall when that was going through Tynwald, officers said, expressed privately some concerns about the biodiversity strategy, that it was fine words, warm words, but there was no money to back it up. There was nothing there to support landowners, to support the officers that would be required to actually make meaningful change. Are you generally happy that at least Tynwald supported the principle?
I'm very happy that Tynwald unanimously supported acknowledgement of the biodiversity and ecological crisis. Yes, that's a real plus. And I'm happy that DEFRA felt that it was more appropriate to support that through the biodiversity strategy. That does have 46 separate actions, I think, thereabouts, last time I checked. But like you, and both probably Biosphere and Biodiversity Strategy and DEFRA generally, in terms of its ecosystems support and its agri-environment schemes, support for sustainable future and where farming is moving, and our whole land management of the future. Climate Board Treasury recently supported a paper from DEFRA to have a complete land management plan mapped out for the island. So that will be a great indicator to direct people what's the best where's the best place to plant trees, for instance, where's the best place as a salt marsh to be retained and preserved. And I specifically timed the motion for December to acknowledge COP15 taking place in Canada at the minute. And the big headline coming out of there is that they want to achieve 30% of land and sea reserves protected by 2030. And there were some very encouraging comments by both Dr. Michelle Hayward, who brought an amendment to link us to the biodiversity strategy, and the DEFRA Minister Claire Barber, to say that we will have in the future, hopefully earlier in next year, a full debate on Biosphere Reserve, and obviously wanting to go for reaccreditation in 2026, but also coming back to where they're heading with biodiversity. And Michelle Hayward gave us an enormous amount of detail about some very rare species that are constantly being discovered or rediscovered and registered on the island. So there's a lot of work going on. Yes, we can always have more resources put into it. Perhaps it could be even better, but we have to balance that against everything else the government's doing. But I thought, out of all the years I have been in Tynwald and battling away, and this was the bit that got deleted in the amendments from declaring the climate crisis in 2019. So I think I've seen government shift enormously towards looking at our ESG commitments and particularly sustainability and climate aspects. So yeah, I think it was a good week for Tynwald.
But Phil, I would say to add to that, I think the key here though is to me the frustration is not recognising that what we have is because of the farming practices that have been going on for generations. We're not very good at valuing what we already have. And of course, there's always need to do more, but recognising that what we have is of great value, and actually what we have is produced from agriculture, which is very inefficient in many ways, and it's very challenging. We're already finding it challenging, but then we don't put the support in place that recognises that. I think that's to me what's quite frustrating.
We had a very similar discussion, Rob, with the fisheries industry, in which a number of officers and people engaged with the industry spoke, and ultimately they said they spoke of promise. There was great opportunity for the industry, and when it came to how much is actually invested, I think there was a £37,000 worth of grants to fishermen. Now, admittedly, they also provide the sort of the policing of the fishery through the department, but it felt like a similar sort of debate that we were talking. Actually, government doesn't put enough into this. If it was a brownfield site, it'd be no problem. We'd put millions in, but the opportunity from the food production sector doesn't seem to be recognised in the same way.
Well, take you back just slightly to your comments earlier about the strategy. The strategy there is there, but the investment not necessarily following. And I think what came out in the debate yesterday, and actually I think prior to that, a year or so ago, Minister Thomas, Chris Thomas, MHK as he was then, and myself asked for an update on how the strategy was performing, and because we were concerned that there was supposed to be a delivery plan that came along with the strategy, and it just never arrived. It wasn't there. So we asked for a half-time report, and that was received into Tynwald. I forget now, probably 18 months ago, and that did show that even though there wasn't a delivery plan, there were actions being undertaken, and then we heard more on those points in Tynwald yesterday. So that gives me some reassurance that those things are happening, and investment is being found to do some of those things. But I think in that same half-time report, there was a lot of predicting a future truth. I think a lot of the stuff that was flagged as being green and complete or on target was actually a promise of something that's going to happen next year or the year after that. So we still have to keep our eyes on those promises and make sure that they deliver.
Sadly, we are at the end of the programme. So basically, the message there, Rob, is blackberry jam tomorrow. That was Rob Mercer, Daphne Caine, and Tim Johnston. Is government doing enough to support our struggling food production sector? Is food production too important to be left to the financial markets, or do you think farming is the same as any other business and should live or die by its profitability and efficiency? Do you agree with Tynwald that we are living through a global biodiversity and ecological crisis? Let me know your thoughts and views on the programme by contacting Phil Gorn at manxradio.com, and get in touch if you have any ideas for future shows. Don't forget this programme is available as a podcast on Manx Radio's website. For now though, I'm Phil Gorn. Guramayo, thanks for listening.